What would the world look like if the Russians had dropped a large EMP strike on America and ended up taking over the entire United States? Or if some drunk Scottish princes marched all the way over to Egypt, ended up fighting them in their drunken state, taking over Egypt, and then raising an entire army and an empire and taking over the entire world? Or if the internet itself had never been invented? They are some absolutely nutty alternate histories, alternate timelines. We will, as always, explore all of them in full. And so, grab a drink. My choice today is chai tea, and join me as we explore the alternate history iceberg. And just before we start the video, there is some new limited edition hand-drawn Halloween merch up, available in the shop down below, and I just absolutely adore this. It features some of our favorite cryptids, monsters, even aliens. I absolutely love the design. So yeah, grab them while they are still available. As I said, this is going to be a limited Halloween run. Thank you as always to everyone who supports the channel. And now let's get back into the final tiers of the alternate history iceberg. In tier 15, we have fault line 49. So this is an alt history where instead of 9/11 happening, instead there is a massive car bombing in Canada that destroys the Edmonton, Alberta World Trade Center. And this then triggers a war between Canada and the United States, which leads to America actually invading and then occupying Canada. But the story takes us through a reporter's view of Canada as he heads into Canada from America. And while he's doing this, he's recording everything. He's reporting on all of these occupied territories, like the events that are happening, the people that he meets. And there are some spoilers down below in case you want to go read it eventually. But basically, he's trying to track down a man called Bruce Kalnichuk, and I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but this was the guy who was thought to be behind the bombing. And then things just get slowly darker and darker, crazier and crazier, and yeah, seems like an awesome novel. From the Fatherland with Love is an alternate timeline in which a weakened Japan is in 2011 invaded by North Korea. They take over the entire island of Kyushu, and the Koreans then try to hold on to this island, all while the Japanese, mostly in guerrilla forces and groups, try to fight them back and reclaim their land. The Japanese government is kind of useless in this, and they don't really send in enough reinforcements, which does kind of suck. But for the most part, that is the timeline side of it. But the real treasure, the real beauty of this story comes in the form of the characters and of the writing. The timeline has won 2 writing awards, and honestly, for good reason. From what I can tell, all the reviews of it seem to say that it is incredibly well written, it is deep, complex, it has some amazing in-depth characters that are both on the Japanese and the North Korean side. It includes multiple moral dilemmas, dark humor, witty, realistic scenarios and exchanges. And this is in no small part to the author Ryu Murakami actually spending 3 years researching the novel before writing it. And this research included interviews with Japanese civilians and military personnel and over 20 North Korean refugees. And I don't think, honestly, this move would turn out too great for the North Koreans in our timeline. But this is an alternate timeline, so who really knows? Attentatet i Polhue skog, or attack in the Polhue forest. And my lord, if I have any Swedish viewers out there, I do apologize for these pronunciations. But this was an alternate timeline written in which these Swedish communists blow up a German train that was traveling through Sweden, and on that train there just so happens to be German soldiers, as well as, it turns out, Eva Braun, otherwise known as Hitler's girlfriend. So naturally, Hitler gets mad. Germany then invades Sweden, something that obviously didn't happen in World War II. And Germany wins this war quite handily, but with all of these extra resources that it's had to use, it basically puts them in a worse position versus Russia. And so Operation Barbarossa, which was the German invasion of Russia, happens 3 weeks later, which means Stalin is able to gather more troops more effectively, and Germany collapses even sooner than they do in our timeline. Hitler ends up dying, so yay. Less people, soldiers, civilians, etc., also end up dying because the war is just a little bit shorter. With it being specifically noted that only 4 million Jews died in this timeline, as opposed to the roughly 6 million in our timeline. And then apparently that's kind of the major changes in it. History then kind of goes back to normal after this. So yeah, it's a bit of an uneventful one, but honestly, any timeline that gets Hitler to die sooner, I am all for. It Happened Here was a film written in 1964 that is honestly an incredibly unique film. Now, the plot itself isn't super unique. It's the classic Germany wins World War II scenario, and this involves Germany invading Britain after the Battle of Dunkirk, and with them actually successfully occupying and taking over the islands. And before we get into the story, the production of this film is very interesting. And it was the brainchild of 18-year-old Kevin Brownlow, who thought up the plot in 1956 and collaborated with 16-year-old Andrew Mollo. And this was generally for help with historical accuracy, basically, as Andrew knew more about that than Kevin generally did. And over the next 8 years, these two basically write out this entire film in full with all the historical accuracies they can muster, and then they end up filming it, producing it themselves using mostly volunteer actors, borrowed film equipment, and the entire film in total costs around 7,000 British pounds, which in terms of film cost scales, that is insanely cheap. But as I said, for the storyline, the Germans invade Britain. They then occupy both Britain and Ireland. And the story roughly follows this Irish nurse called Pauline, who is evacuated from her small village and sent to London. She overall tries to remain sort of fairly apolitical, staying out of the debates, staying out of one side or the other. In her eyes, she's just there to do a job, to nurse people. But throughout the film, with more and more attacks on some of her friends, who either end up dying or are badly injured, and the atrocities that she's either forced to participate in or learns about or sees or witnesses, she slowly becomes more and more emotionally and politically involved. And once again, spoilers ahead in case you feel like watching this. But in the end, she is arrested for refusing to follow orders, which is just classic World War II Germany. But she is then captured by these good British forces, who basically combine with some American forces, and they slowly and successfully, it seems, take back both the British Isles and Ireland. The Bush Soldiers is an alternate timeline in which Japan invades Australia during World War II, and Australian resistance fighters work basically to sabotage them, to fight against them, and to ultimately stop the invasion. The story focuses on one of the men in this resistance, named Jeffrey Sawtell, who is, at the time, a World War I veteran, and it's honestly a fairly close-knit timeline. It doesn't necessarily focus on the worldwide political shifts or really on the consequences of this invasion, but more so on the lives and experiences and decisions of these individual characters based around the invasion. But the Australian outback seems to be quite a hellish landscape, even on its own, let alone with invading Japanese forces thrown into the mix. And so I wouldn't really want this situation for myself, but I guess who would? A Scotsman in Egypt is honestly one of my favorite alternate histories that I've read so far, and it is just hilarious. It's very unique, and it was written in 2006. And so in this timeline, in the year 1080, two Scottish princes decide to, after an incredibly drunk night, they decide to raise an army to march all the way from Scotland to Egypt, and their plan actually somehow works. With a good bit of luck mixed in with Scottish madness and bravery, this allows them basically entry into Egypt. They then backstab the Egyptians, launch a full-blown war against them, and actually succeed. They then start their Scottish Empire from Egypt, which eventually spreads out to Spain, to Hungary, eventually all throughout Europe, and also the Middle East, with them often winning battles and wars in some strange ways. In contrast with, for example, say the Romans, who are incredibly disciplined, methodical, reasoned, orderly sort of thing, the Scots normally overwhelm their opponents with just sheer guile, with bravery, or for lack of a better reason, being substantially drunk. And as I said, they eventually take over Southern Europe, even eventually going into Northern Europe. They more or less end up taking over the Catholic Church, so it's now Scottish instead of Italian. And the story ends with them teasing at a potential journey and the potential conquering of America, which was, in our timeline, an invasion and journey that wouldn't be made for at least a few hundred more years. So as I said, this is definitely on my to-read list. It honestly just sounds incredible, fun, crazy, hectic. You know, it's been quoted in a review that I found that it is a story in which the historical accuracy takes a backseat to the spectacle of Scots rewriting the medieval world one drunken brawl at a time. And I really need to read this. If Lee had not won the Battle of Gettysburg. So this is an essay actually written by none other than Winston Churchill. And it was written in 1931 before World War II and explores, quite naturally, if Robert E. Lee hadn't won the Battle of Gettysburg, which leads eventually to the South winning the US Civil War. And this isn't an incredibly in-depth alternate history, I wouldn't say. It's more of like a what if hypothetical sort of scenario, but it basically says that the South would then win the war and they would end slavery, and due to Britain acting as like a mediator between the North and the South, this would lead to some sort of NATO sort of deal between the three nations, that being Britain, North America, or the Union, and then the Confederacy. And then, because this alliance exists, because it is a solid alliance by essentially the three most powerful countries in the world, or what will become the three most powerful. Because of this, World War I never ends up happening, at least not to the extent that it did in our timeline. So it's a very interesting essay and thought experiment, I would say, like especially with the abolition of slavery, which might sound a little bit counterintuitive if the Confederacy won, but this, Churchill writes, is basically down to Robert E. Lee's brilliant strategic mind. And this is not a comment on Robert E. Lee's politics, so to speak, in terms of what he supported, whether you agree or disagree with him, but it's more to say that regardless of which side of the fence you sit on, most politicians and historians can't deny that he was an incredibly smart fellow. And so in this alternate timeline, with the South winning the war, he kind of realizes that this whole slavery thing, you know, it's already been outlawed by the British, it's slowly being outlawed in the rest of Europe, and so there seems to be this trend worldwide moving against slavery. And so Robert E. Lee, after winning the war, realizes that this is kind of one of the Confederacy's only weaknesses. Like, he thinks if we keep slavery, you'll eventually have Britain against us, you'll have the rest of Europe against us. It'd be very easy for North America or the Union to convince other nations to join them because they're fighting against slavery in the South. And so he reasons that the amount of money they're generating from slavery isn't worth the long-term repercussions. And so he just ends up abolishing slavery, which is really a very clever move. Like, now you can't say we're fighting against slavery because the South doesn't have slaves. They're just a normal country, just like you, and it's really hard for other countries to condemn them or to fight against them, which will, in the end, generate them more money and success. Pavane, or Pavani, or Pavani was a novel written in 1968 in which Queen Elizabeth I of England is assassinated, and this was in 1588, just as the Spanish Armada is arriving. And so, with the Queen dead, there is naturally a lot of infighting between different citizens, between the Protestants and the Catholics of England, which leads to the Spanish Armada actually landing and invading successfully, eventually stamping out Protestants Protestantism and declaring Roman Catholicism as the one true religion allowed in England. The Netherlands is then prevented from forming by the Catholic Spaniards due to them being Protestant, and Spain does such a good job at stamping out Protestantism that even after the Spanish power collapses, the Catholic power, i.e. the Church and the Pope, etc., grow so powerful that they basically rule the entirety of Europe. And because they rule over Europe, a lot of discoveries and land grabs, like for example the British in Australia and the Europeans in North and South America, are all done in the name of Catholicism. Feudalism as a system continues for hundreds of years after it initially fell out of popularity, for example in our timeline. And feudalism itself, for those who haven't heard of it, is basically like slavery but with extra steps. In feudalism, the king owned all of the land, and he granted it to various nobles in exchange for a military pledge and support. And so the nobles then kind of owned all of their land, and they granted their land out to knights for also a military pledge. And then these knights would grant small pieces of land for peasants to live on in exchange for them working on the land. So by living on this land, the peasants didn't own the land, but in order for them to live there and for them to get food from the crops, etc., they had to just work there. And so, as I said, just slavery with extra steps. Also in this timeline, with the Catholic Church in charge of everything, certain advancements in technology, like for example electricity, is deemed illegal, with eventually towards the end some rumors of revolt and revolution, etc., are starting to bubble underneath the surface. It honestly seems like a pretty interesting alternate history. Like, there are major changes throughout Europe and the world. It's set far enough back in the past, I think, that the scenes and the environment and change of settings and scenes are quite refreshing. You know, it's not the same old World War II alternate histories, and it generally gets good reviews, so if you like the sound of this one, definitely go check it out. In Search of the Epitaph. So in our timeline, in 1910, Japan annexed and took over Korea. But after World War II, after Japan was defeated, Korea gained independence, and that eventually led to the world that we all know today. But in this alternate timeline, in 1909, the Japanese Prime Minister Hirobumi actually survives his assassination attempt, which he died in our timeline. But because he survives this attempt, he rules Japan for a further 15 years. And so they now not only still own Korea, but also Taiwan and areas of Manchuria and various islands around the Pacific. And so, since they didn't join World War II in the same way, they also aren't massively defeated by the Americans. Nuclear bombs end up being dropped on Germany instead of Japan. And because Korea never ends up gaining their independence, Japan rules them for the entire time. They end up basically destroying Korean culture, Korean history, the language, and a lot of the Koreans end up fleeing to China, and their influence over there that caused the North Korean South Korean split basically just ends up happening in China, with North China becoming the People's Republic of China, which is backed up by the Soviets, and South China being the Republic of China. So it's a very, very interesting story and novel, I think. It generally explores life and politics in this heavily Korean suppressed world, and it's actually never been translated into English, at least in full. So you can read about it in English, you can read about the plot lines and the characters and the summaries, etc., but you cannot, at least for now, actually read the entire story. So honestly, I think a pretty cool one. I hope someone will translate it fully into English, maybe sometime soon. But yeah, fingers crossed. The Grey Victory explores a world in which the South wins the US Civil War, and this is when Jeb Stuart from the South survives a wound that he died from originally in our timeline. This leads to a military stalemate with the North, and eventually this changes things with the North electing George McClellan instead of re-electing Abe Lincoln. And with this stalemate in place, McClellan basically sues for peace and settles with the South, leading to basically a Southern victory. Slavery in this timeline, unlike our Winston Churchill timeline, does end up continuing in the South. And so this whole timeline is filled with general kind of rough assassination plots by a lot of these Northerners looking to kill several Confederate figures. And this overall is with aims to kill these figures to anger the South and then to start a new civil war in which hopefully the North will win, take over the South, and abolish slavery. Aztec Century takes place in a world where Hernan Cortez, who was a guy in our timeline who went over to South America, ended up killing and basically enslaving a bunch of the natives. But in this timeline, he does go over into South America, just like he did originally, but he instead ends up joining with the Aztecs and supporting them and then fighting off these subsequent Spanish invasions, which just sounds absolutely insane. This then leads to a more advanced Aztec civilization. They end up adopting Christianity in the 1600s and becoming a full-blown worldwide superpower in the 1900s, eventually expanding its empire across the Americas, across Asia, and across Europe, which is just a really unique and fascinating concept. In the 1990s, the Aztecs end up attacking Britain. London is then taken, the royal family is captured, and by the end of the novel, the Aztecs more or less have a complete foothold on most of the world. And then they get super technologically advanced, they start exploring alternate dimensions, and it is pretty insane. Past Watch, the redemption of Christopher Columbus. So this timeline is initially set in the future, where the world is basically a huge mess. It's almost destroyed, it's completely run down, and this company called Past Watch uses basically this time-traveling technology to watch or to view the past in order to study history, which is such a cool concept. But with the state that the world is currently in, this company decides, you know what? We're not just gonna view history, we're gonna actually change the past. And so maybe they could have changed their name from Past Watch to Past Change, I don't know. But they go back in time, they identify Christopher Columbus's voyage to the Americas, and they basically pinpoint that yeah, that is the exact point where history diverged and was the beginning of the end. And so their ultimate goal in this, when traveling back in time, is to stop that from happening. And there ends up being a massive plot twist, which, as always, spoilers if you maybe want to read this later. But when they do their research and look back in time, they realize that the timeline that we are currently living in which Christopher Columbus went over to the Americas and that led to the European invasion, that wasn't actually the original timeline. They find out that in the original timeline, Christopher Columbus was basically just a slave trader who died a fairly uneventful normal death, but that another time-traveling group had actually gone back in time before this, and they changed things round so that Christopher Columbus ended up sailing to the Americas, colonizing them, etc. And so at this point they start to feel a little bit less nervous about changing the past. Like, now that they know that it was already changed anyway, and they're just maybe putting it back to what it was, or changing it again, it doesn't make them feel as guilty. And so, as a mission, they end up sending 2 time travelers back in time, and they send them back to South America in order to try and strengthen the South American people, get them all to rally together, to put aside their differences, to form a stronger society, so that when the Europeans arrive, they can basically hold their own. Or sorry, they send one person back to do that, and the other person they send back actually gets sent back to Christopher Columbus, and he is tasked with finding the ship that Christopher Columbus voyaged out on, with boarding it before it leaves, and during its floating across to the Americas, he is tasked with sinking it. And so this eventually happens towards the end of the voyage. The ship sinks, Christopher Columbus ends up washing up on shore, and then because of this, because he's helped by the natives, he has a change of heart, he has sort of a mini revelation, and so just like in one of our more previous entries, this strengthens up the Aztecs and the Native Americans, which leads to more of a balanced war war between them and the Europeans. And so they're kind of happy with this change, but the people who from the future ended up going back in time, and of course the entire future team, the members of Past Watch, they essentially, by making this change, end up erasing their own existence, which they seem to be okay with. They seem to see it as kind of like a noble sacrifice, sacrificing their existence for a better eventual world. And that is kind of how the novel ends, with an open future and no clear storyline as to what happens past the 1500s. Kerberos Panzer Kopf is a two-part manga that explores what the world might look like if, once again, Germany had won World War II. But also not just that. It also looks at what would have happened if Germany then went and invaded Japan. And so in this timeline, Japan is under this dictatorial, authoritarian German government, and it is ruled by this special forces group that is nicknamed Kerberos after Cerberus, basically working as a counter-terrorist unit in Japan. And all over Japan, there are these kind of attacks taking place, these revolts, these resurgencies, and this Kerberos group is in charge of stamping them out, of detecting them. They're kind of like the Gestapo in Germany proper, but all the while under this German rule, Japan slowly gets poorer and poorer and seems to be going the way of North Korea, except with the Germans ruling instead of Koreans. And what the hell is this name? There are so many of those funny A's. But this is the timeline of Pakalako Haraya, which means the skull moth in English, or the death's head hawk moth, which I think is just the most amazing badass name ever, especially from Moth. But this Finnish alt history is set in 1986, and it explores a world where Finland loses the 1944 war with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union then ends up taking them over and occupying them. Finland then becomes a Soviet state run kind of at a distance by Russia, and there is slowly a underground terrorist group forming in Finland called the Blue Army faction, and their intent obviously is to force the Soviets out of Finland, and they do this through your typical, insurgency methods, explosions everywhere, kidnappings, assassinations, uprisings, and basically any other tactic with the aim of destabilizing control and of freeing Finland. It touches on some difficult political and moral topics, I think, like whether these violent and some would say evil means are actually justified by their noble ends. And so yeah, it seems like a great timeline. Death is lighter than a feather, which, when we think about that, is it really? Like, really, is death lighter than a feather? But this explores a timeline where, for whatever reason, the nuclear option isn't available in World War II, and so naturally, the Japanese don't surrender at all to the Americans, and so a land invasion of Japan is started by America. And this alt history is very character heavy, as it generally unfolds through the perspectives of, I think it's 18 characters, and these range from American soldiers to American civilians, Japanese soldiers and civilians, politicians, and so it's kind of Game of Thronesy in that way. And it is both during the lead up to the invasion and during the invasion itself. And it does go through some somewhat heavy cultural differences between the Americans and the Japanese. The main one, of course, probably being the Japanese kind of honor system. The bravery and the willingness to die and to fight absolutely to the end. Like, surrendering, even if it's the right decision, is absolutely not an option for a lot of the Japanese. You would be dishonored, you might even be killed, you would be pushed out of your family and society a lot of the times. So the honorable thing, the right thing, is always just to stay there, fight like absolute crazy, never surrender, which is one of the reasons actually why a land invasion by America was so feared by the Americans. They knew that, look, if we go and invade Japan by land, you will have everyone, you will have soldiers, farmers, civilians just running out, attacking us. They will never surrender, and we will lose a lot of American soldiers' lives. And so this timeline, this story, I think, does open up some quite big moral dilemmas, like the common one that was always talked about after World War II, of whether it was justified dropping nukes on Japan. Because you think while a bunch of innocent people did die during these nukes, the alternative would have been to do a land invasion, which very likely would have led to much, much more Japanese deaths and many more American deaths. So it's like, do you choose the nukes, do a lot of damage, kill a lot of innocent people, but then put an end to the war? Or do you have a prolonged war that doesn't use nukes and you end up killing maybe twice as many, 5 times as many, 10 times as many people, or even more, which is honestly always a good question. Worldwide what? Worldwide who? Worldwide when? Those last two weren't actually part of the title. But Worldwide What is an alternate timeline that explores a world where the internet was never developed. So in this timeline, the ARPANET, or the Advanced Research Projects Agency Network, which is a mouthful. But in our timeline, this did actually exist, the ARPANET, and it was kind of a precursor to the internet technology. But in this alternate timeline, this gets shut down due to various funding issues, various technological issues, and so the eventual offspring of it, being the full-blown internet, is never born. Everyone in this timeline ends up communicating through like fax systems and local area network systems. So you can send stuff from like one room to the other. You can send it probably in the same office block or something. But in terms of sending stuff all the way around the world, that's not really a thing. They also use bloody pigeons and squirrels for sending mail, which is just amazing. I can just imagine writing out a letter, opening my window, handing it to a squirrel, and then instead of stamps, you would use, I guess, like nuts to pay the squirrels. So you give them a letter, you give them one nut, and then they tell you that the cost has gone up for mail, and so you're like, oh, geez, go into your pocket, get another nut, pay it to this squirrel. But yeah, in this alternate timeline, there does seem to exist the internet, but it is a top secret worldwide communication network used by like governments and large corporations. And it's this huge underground secret network of people all using this new internet and keeping it away from the common person. And the story itself focuses on a man named Richard Grayson, who is a British journalist who discovers this plot. And this is this plot to destroy this new technology, or this new up-and-coming internet technology that would, as we're so used to now, that would allow the world to seamlessly communicate wirelessly, because the powers that be fear that if the common man gets access to this, it'll be giving them too much power, too much freedom, and of course, as a government, you cannot allow that. And whenever I read histories like this, I sometimes think back to before the internet was invented. Like, not that I was alive back then, but just the tales that I hear from either my parents or other people that I know that were around back then. And even in my childhood, you didn't have smartphones where you could search for everything you wanted, all at the drop of a hat. Like, we did have internet, but that was on a super slow, clunky computer back at home. And so you typically couldn't search for example, restaurant reviews or movie reviews or video game reviews. You had to get them in these magazines that were printed out every now and then. And even then, a bunch of these magazines were paid for, they were sponsored, and so you normally wouldn't get an objective review from them. And I also remember the days before any sort of sat-nav. And so if you're driving somewhere, you had to look up the rough general direction on a map, and then you would follow street signs, and then if you got lost somehow, you'd have to pull over, pull out this giant map, and then find exactly where you are, write down any directions. And the same would go for finding your way sort of in town. If you were going to meet someone in a different part of the city, since you just had an old block Nokia phone, you had to write down the route, find it somewhere online, write it down on a piece of paper, and then go out there. And then if you got lost, then there's just nothing you could do. You had to actually talk to another human being, which is wild, I know. You had to ask them for directions and then find it that way. And also, while I'm on this tangent, if you think about before mobile phones became like mainstream, like just think of how insane that would have been. So first of all, before the invention of like a regular telephone, you would have to write someone by letter saying, yes, I'm coming to visit you in 2 months. Send it off to them. They would send you one back a week later saying, yes, that is acceptable. And then if they changed their minds at the last second or whatever, you wouldn't have any choice. You'd be on your way to see them anyway. And then even as phones were invented, there were only really phones inside households. And so you could call your relatives, call your friends. They would pick up their house phone. You would say, oh yeah, can I meet you up at this place at 7 o'clock? But then after you left the house, unless you stopped by a payphone or something, they had no way of letting you know anything. You had no way of calling them. And so you would have to both kind of trust each other that you would get to somewhere on time. You couldn't let the other person know that you were late or anything. And it is just a very, very different time to the one that we currently live in. And in a lot of ways, the internet ended up giving a voice to the voiceless. So you no longer had to be working in a newspaper factory or company. You no longer had to be working in primetime television. It did give the ability to the common person, just the random dude off the street, to, for example, make 3-hour or 5-hour or 8-hour videos talking about aliens, and for thousands of people to watch them, which, as you can imagine, I am incredibly thankful and grateful for the internet and for all of you guys. America with a K. And this dives into a world where Russia in the 1980s launches a large EMP strike on America, disabling all its defenses and allowing a relatively bloodless invasion of America by the Russians. And then fast forward to 1997, America is a Russian state. And the TV series follows multiple people, one a ex-US presidential candidate, also his wife, also his military friend, a colonel, as they basically live in this new regime and work their way around and through it. And of course, it wouldn't be an invasion story if there wasn't a resistance movement of some kind, obviously aiming to fight back against the Soviets and to take back America. And I think the United States of America is in quite a unique position in that it's almost impossible for a foreign power to invade them, physically. Like, sure, they might invade the politics or from the inside, but in terms of a pure land invasion, first of all, the landmass is huge. They have various rivers all along America, enabling optimal imports, so they're able to get weapons from all around the world. Their coastline is just ridiculous. It'd basically be impossible to block them. And they have all of the mountain ranges in America. And as I said, with just the sheer landmass, they would be able to produce stuff in the center of America, just non-stop, send it out to the edges, all while any invading country has to do so basically by sea. So yeah, I don't know how realistic necessarily this alternate history is. And also, they would, in theory, have the largest military in the world, as you would generally have like over 100 million people in America who either own guns or who have access to them. And so if you compare it to the largest army in the world with China at 2 million going up against the 100 million strong civilian army in America, yeah, I don't think it would even be close, but it is still somewhat of an interesting miniseries nonetheless. The Third World War, the Untold Story. So this covers a timeline where NATO and the Warsaw Pact end up basically coming to throes, and a war is started. A couple of nuclear strikes end up hitting, for example, Birmingham in the UK and also Minsk in the USSR, basically almost completely destroying them. Then the Soviet Union itself collapses due to infighting, and this alternate history has sort of an alternate ending within its own existence. And this is an alternate ending where NATO disarms, at least nuclearly, which leads to the Soviet Union seeing this as an opportunity to take over the rest of Europe. And they're able to do this by utilizing the threat of a nuclear attack, because they're, in this timeline, the only ones with nukes. So yeah, I think I am all for nuclear disarmament, but of course it would have to be mutual nuclear disarmament, because there's no point throwing away your own gun if your enemy, who still wants to kill you, has his shotgun fully loaded. Lest darkness fall. So this one is a time traveling one, which... yeah, I don't know how I feel about time-traveling timelines, but we will see where this one goes. But this follows a man named Martin Padway, who is an archaeologist visiting Rome in 1938. And while he is there, he is suddenly struck by lightning and transported back in time through to 535 AD. And as a shameless plug, because I don't think I've done one in this video, if you do like the Roman Empire, Roman times, Roman emperors, leaders, battle positions, then go and check out my ultimate Roman iceberg, linked down in the description below. But in this alternate timeline, Martin finds himself in a time where the Eastern Roman Emperor, Justinian, is heading over to Western Rome, because at the time, Western Rome was basically just taken over by the barbarians, these being the Gothic and Ostrogothic tribes. So in this timeline, Martin finds himself in the past. He knows enough Latin to communicate somewhat passably with the people, and he works first as an archaeologist, then he becomes a brandy selling merchant, all the while inventing a bunch of stuff from the future. For example, he invents the printing press, he invents the semaphore telegraph, he invents double entry bookkeeping, which I'm just surprised that that wasn't invented already, with double entry bookkeeping basically being whenever a sale is recorded, then the purchase is also recorded. So you're able to tally them up one to one, you're able to link them with whoever bought them. And yeah, this was apparently a thing that was never done in the past. But through all of these inventions, they end up making him incredibly wealthy, and then he uses this wealth and his new inventions to basically help the Goths defend against Eastern Rome. He then crowns himself King Martinus, and he uses these new military tactics and technologies, for example, gunpowder, in order to fight off the Romans. And with this, the Goths and Europe, etc., become more and more technologically and militarily and politically advanced, which basically averts the entire European Dark Ages. And that's more or less the story. It's apparently a very easy read. It's very fun, witty, humorous, creative. So check it out if you like the sound of it. Konpeki no Kentai. And yay, more time travel ones. But this was a Japanese written alternate history that starts with Admiral Isokuro Yamamoto, who dies in a plane crash in 1943. Now, this also happened in our timeline, but in this alternate timeline, after dying in this crash, he wakes up 38 years earlier in 1905, and he basically uses his future knowledge in order to bring about massive advancement in Japan, which in turn turns Japan into a massive superpower and obviously a naval powerhouse. So since they are so powerful, they have no need to take over anyone. You know, they've already done that in this timeline. So when World War II comes around, they are secure enough in and of themselves to basically be a little bit more chill, to side with the Allies, and so with the Allies they end up defeating Germany and winning World War II. But things in this timeline start to go a little bit sideways when the Japanese Prime Minister is basically couped. You know, he's forced out of politics. Admiral Yamamoto ends up dying in prison. Japan itself, the giant powerful Japan, starts to unravel a little bit, and then the alternate timeline just kind of ends. So what happens afterwards could very well be an alternate timeline of its own, which may eventually be made by someone further down the line. But for now, this timeline in and of itself seems quite interesting and quite fun. SCP-ES061. And oh boy, am I very excited for some of these SCP entries. So you can consider this a slight prequel or teaser to the SCP Iceberg that I will be making quite soon, coming to a computer or TV screen near you. But yeah, SCP-ES-601 is an entry from the Spanish side of the SCP Foundation, which is basically kind of like this fictional database for those of you who haven't heard of the SCP universe or Foundation. But it's this fictional database that's kind of like the Men in Black, and it explores these strange items, people, entities, creatures, and concepts, and honestly just like all sorts. There seems to be an unlimited amount of categories for these things, but they are all either strange, alien, otherworldly, other-dimensionally, and most of them would be harmful to our world, to humanity as a whole, to society. And so there's this secret group of people called the SCP, which stands for Secure, Contain, Protect. And their job, kind of like the Men in Black, is to go around, find all of these wherever they pop up in the world, and as the name suggests, secure them, contain them however they can, and protect society. So if this sounds cool to you, it is a very cool topic. I have some icebergs for it planned in the very near future, so absolutely subscribe and stay tuned for those. But this particular entry refers to a VCR player that was found in the 21st century. The exact year is unspecified. And this VHS player, whenever a VHS tape is inserted into it, it basically plays on the TV an alternate reality version of this tape. So, for instance, if you put in Star Wars A New Hope, what played in this account of it was Star Wars The New Knights, featuring Luke Starkiller with a bunch of characters from the Star Wars universe, just a little bit different than from the ones in our reality. They then inserted a Back to the Future tape, and it shows this future with Marty as a jazz musician named Miles McFly, and he's driving a 1950s Cadillac, not a DeLorean. Biff is instead a trumpet player, and the whole storyline is them trying to fix a jukebox in order to bring them back to the future. This video then suddenly ends like roughly halfway through with text saying script discarded, with this whole thing implying that maybe whatever they showed on screen was actually an early draft script for the film. And there is no evidence for this, it is just purely in the SCP universe, but that's kind of the angle that they were going for. So it's a very cool SCP entry, obviously connecting to this iceberg as it seems to display alternate histories, alternate timelines. And so if you like these SCPs and you can't wait for my ultimate SCP iceberg, then absolutely go and check this one out for yourself. SCP-140, the Davites, is honestly just amazing. So this is a history book that is found in the SCP universe that doesn't just tell history or retell it, but rather it actually alters history. And this history book tells us of this ancient subrace of humans called the Davites, who are an aggressive, violent, war-hungry, cannibalistic species with pale white skin, red eyes, sharp teeth, which honestly just look like things of absolute nightmares. And it seems like in the regular timeline, this species never existed until the book SCP-140 was written. And then this changes reality, it changes history into, okay, this species did once exist, but it was like so long ago in our history, they ended up getting wiped out by the Chinese general Qin Kai, and this was all the way back in the 3rd century BC. But the thing with this book, right, is that the book actually writes itself as long as it has access to liquids, with human blood actually being the most effective writing fluid. So if you have this book out in the open and you leave ink nearby, or if you have a nosebleed, or if someone spills some red wine, or just any liquid, this book will soak up the nearby liquids like a sponge and continue to write and retell history. And each time this happens, the dates of the Davites' extinction get retconned to be sooner and sooner, or rather later and later. So originally, as I said, they never existed, and then after it writes a bit more, they did exist but were extinct in the 3rd century BC. And so I said this changes history because we then start to find archaeological evidence of them existing in the 3rd century BC. But then another liquid related incident happens. The book kind of updates itself, and this pushes the extinction date further and further into the future by perhaps a few hundred more years. And then with this change, we start to find more and more recent geographical and archaeological evidence. And so it's like this terrifying race of basically the worst sort of version of human that you can think of. Like, they're basically alien demons. And every time this book rewrites history, these creatures, these demon-like beings, just get closer and closer to us. And so perhaps you can imagine a reality if this book is just left unsecured, uncontained, that it will write the Davites' extinction later and later, like perhaps they went extinct in the 1900s, which just think how massively that would affect mankind. Or even the 1940s, maybe the Davites fought in World War II. That would be absolutely terrifying. Or you can imagine a world eventually where they do still exist in this modern day. So as I said, it's a super dark, super scary, but a little bit fun of an idea. Like, it's very creative, I would say. But that is just one of the many SCP alternate histories. And speaking of SCP alternate histories, we have the SCP-117 Islamic Union of Eastern Samothrace. And are we in the SCP Iceberg already? Did I stumble across an SCP entry that actually retcons this entire iceberg to be an SCP iceberg? No. This seems to be the last one. Okay, so the SCP-1173 is a bit of a strange one, in that it doesn't really exist as an item or as a person or anything physical, but it's more like a mental infection that spreads from person to person. And it is regarding this fictional country of the Islamic Union of Eastern Samothrace. And basically what happens is when one infected person says the term, "You hear about that thing down in Samothrace?" This immediately affects anyone listening, and once they're infected, they slowly start noticing fabricated clues and references and media, etc., referencing this country, even though objectively there is zero evidence for its existence, which is a very interesting, like, mind virus or spread of belief sort of thing. And there's, I think, a very interesting alternate viewpoint on this entry's page, which states that they're not too sure if this country doesn't exist and the infection spreads convincing people that it's real, or whether this country does actually exist and is in dire need of help, like perhaps they're at constant war and their people are being subjugated, but for some reason this infection has spread around, erasing people's knowledge and memories of this country. And conversely, the infection can only be cured by someone speaking the phrase, "You hear about that thing down in Samothrace," or Samothrace. So a very cool entry. As always, I cannot wait to get into these SCP icebergs, as they remind me of the old internet days. They're very well written. They blow my mind every time I read them. So it is a very cool entry, and there are much more to come in the upcoming SCP icebergs. And that is all we have time for. There will be finally one more video in this iceberg, which should be out maybe in a week or two. I know it's been a little while between this one and the last one, but we will finally be able to wrap up the entire alternate history iceberg. And I honestly didn't think that it would go on for this long. I just thought, oh, alternate histories would be kind of interesting. I'll just do a few of those. And then it ended up turning into a year-long iceberg. But as always, like the video if you liked it, subscribe to stay tuned for the upcoming videos. Thank you so much for watching and for your support over these few years. It has really meant the world to me. And if you have any other suggestions for icebergs, or for videos, or for topics or cases you want me to cover individually, then absolutely leave them in the comment section down below. But wherever you may be, I hope you are having a lovely day, week, night, morning, whatever. And as always, thanks for watching.